The document is dated 3 October 1941. Location: Royal Air Force Station, Duxford, Cambridgeshire, England. Author: Wing Commander Archibald Hope, Commanding Officer of No. 601 Squadron, Auxiliary Air Force. It is typed on standard Air Ministry stationery, countersigned by 2 flight commanders, and forwarded to Fighter Command Headquarters at Bentley Priory that same afternoon. In it, Hope states that the Bell Airacobra Mk.I, the aircraft No. 601 Squadron had been flying since August, was, in his professional judgment, not fit for employment in first-line operational roles over Northwest Europe. He cites poor performance above 15,000 feet. He cites an alarming tendency to enter flat spins from which recovery was uncertain. He cites cockpit ergonomics that place the pilot at a disadvantage in close-quarters maneuvering. He is not unkind about the aircraft. He is professional. He is precise. Every complaint is documented. Every complaint is valid. No. 601 Squadron flew 80 combat sorties in the Airacobra. They recorded no confirmed aerial victories. They turned the aircraft back. 3 years, 7 months, and 11 days later, on 19 May 1945, a Soviet Air Force's pilot named Alexander Ivanovich Pokryshkin landed at an airfield outside Prague, Czechoslovakia. He had just completed his final combat mission of the Second World War. The logbook handed to his regiment's intelligence officer recorded 59 confirmed aerial kills, the second highest total of any Allied pilot in the entire war. 48 of those kills had been made in the same aircraft Wing Commander Hope had formally rejected as unsuitable for frontline service. The aircraft was the Bell P-39 Airacobra. Here is the question this video will answer. If the British were right about the Airacobra, and they were, how did a Soviet pilot flying one become one of the most dangerous men in the sky? To understand what the P-39 was, you have to understand what it was built to do. And to understand that, you have to go back to a specific meeting held in July 1937 at the Bell Aircraft Corporation's facility on Elmwood Avenue in Buffalo, New York. The United States Army Air Corps had issued a requirement. The requirement was for an interceptor, a fighter optimized not for the long-range dogfight, not for close air support, but for one specific mission: climbing fast, reaching high altitude quickly, and destroying incoming bombers before they reached American cities or military installations. The fear was not fighter versus fighter combat. The fear was mass formations of bombers arriving at 30,000 feet, and nothing in the American inventory capable of stopping them. Larry Bell and his chief designer Robert Woods sat down with a piece of paper and an engineering problem. The aircraft they conceived looked like nothing an Air Force had ever flown. The engine, an Allison V-1710, 12 cylinders, liquid-cooled, would be placed not in the nose but behind the cockpit, driving the propeller through an extension shaft running beneath the pilot's seat. This shifted the engine mass to the aircraft's center of gravity and liberated the nose for a weapon that a conventional fighter could never mount: a 37 cannon firing directly through the propeller hub, not rifle-caliber machine guns synchronized between spinning blades, a cannon. A weapon that could structurally destroy a heavy bomber with 3 or 4 rounds. The prototype, designated XB-39, flew on April 6, 1938, at Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio. Test pilot James Taylor pushed it to 20,000 feet in 5 minutes. At altitude, the aircraft reached speeds approaching 400 miles per hour. The turbo supercharger on the prototype's engine, a device that compressed thin high-altitude air to maintain engine power, worked exactly as designed. Then the Army Air Corps asked NACA, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, to evaluate the design at Langley Field, Virginia. NACA found problems. Weight primarily. The XB-39 was heavier than the specification required. NACA's engineers, working across the autumn of 1939 and into the winter of 1940, concluded that certain components could be removed to reduce weight and increase high-altitude speed. The armoring could be lightened. The armament could be simplified. The turbo supercharger, that device which enabled the engine to breathe at altitude, could be eliminated entirely. The rationale was sound by the standards of the moment. American planners did not believe American fighters would be fighting at 30,000 feet over France. They believed they would be defending the continental United States against a strategic bomber threat that had not yet materialized, and arguably never would come from the directions planned for. Within that framework, a turbo supercharger was excess weight for a mission the aircraft might never fly. Brigadier General Oliver P. Eccles, the Air Corps Chief of Material and Procurement, approved the simplification. The production P-39 would fly without it. Read that decision again carefully. It was not incompetence. It was correct engineering applied to a war that planners could imagine rather than the one that came. Without the turbo supercharger, the production airacobra was a transformed aircraft. Below 15,000 feet, it remained capable, fast, heavily armed, maneuverable. Above that altitude, engine performance fell off sharply. At 20,000 feet, where a Spitfire Mk.V or a Bf-109F was in its element, the P-39 was laboring. The 37mm cannon, with its slow cyclic rate and 30-round magazine, was devastating against the slow, predictable geometry of a bomber. Against a maneuvering fighter at high altitude, it was a liability. A weapon for one kind of war, inherited by another. When Britain received its first airacobras in the summer of 1941, No. 601 Squadron at Duxford was the operational test. The pilots were experienced. Wing Commander Hope's October report was earned in the air, not composed at a desk. 80 sorties over northwest Europe, where aerial combat was happening between 15,000 and 30,000 feet, against Bf-109F pilots who had been fighting continuously since the summer of 1940. In that theater, against that enemy at those altitudes, the airacobra was not a first-line aircraft. Hope's conclusion was correct. The Royal Air Force turned back its full allocation of 212 airacobras, most of them having never fired a weapon in anger, and requested different types. The United States Army Air Forces by mid-1942 had formally assigned the P-39 to secondary roles: coastal patrol, ground attack, reconnaissance duties in theaters where high-altitude performance was deemed less critical. The official verdict was filed. That verdict crossed the Atlantic. The Luftwaffe's Intelligence Directorate received translated summaries of both the RAF operational assessment and American deployment decisions. The analysis was filed and distributed. The Bell Airacobra was a second-rate fighter, unsuitable for serious aerial opposition in a first-line theater. The assessment was logged, circulated to wing commanders and marked as accurate. It was accurate. For the war the British and Americans were fighting. In October 1941, the first P-39s shipped under the Lend-Lease Act began arriving in the Soviet Union. They came overland through Iran, unloaded at the port of Bandar Abbas on the Persian Gulf, trucked north through the Zagros Mountains in convoys averaging 11 vehicles each, assembled at improvised airfields outside Tabriz in the autumn cold. The crates arrived with American technical manuals in English. Soviet mechanics worked from the diagrams. The acceptance inspection at the 25th Reserve Aviation Regiment, near Tbilisi, Georgia in November 1941, was conducted by Major Ivan Voronov, the regiment's technical commander. His inspection log, 3 pages handwritten, filed with the regimental records now held in the Central Archive at Podolsk, notes the aircraft's general serviceability. He records the unusual side-entry cockpit doors, a consequence of the mid-engine configuration, as requiring adaptation. He records the 37mm cannon. He records the radio equipment, American manufacture, significantly superior to anything being installed in Soviet domestic fighters at that stage of the war. Then he writes one more thing. He writes that the cockpit visibility, the unobstructed 360-degree sightlines from the bubble-style canopy, better than anything in current Soviet service, is, in his precise bureaucratic phrasing, exceptional. The Soviet pilots who approached the airacobra for the first time did not love it. They did not hate it. They looked at it the way an experienced craftsman looks at an unfamiliar tool, cautious, curious, trying to determine what it was actually good for. That question had not been asked before. It was the right question. Alexander Ivanovich Pokreshkin was born on March 6, 1913 in Novonikolaevsk, a Siberian city later renamed Novosibirsk, though neither name meant anything to the rest of the world when he was growing up there. His father worked in a factory. The family had nothing. He grew up understanding that if you wanted something, you studied it alone, without permission, and proved it to someone afterward. He joined the Red Army in 1932 as an aviation mechanic. He was assigned to the technical track because he was gifted with engines and machinery. Pilot training was not offered to him. For 5 years he maintained other men's aircraft, read everything available on aerodynamics and air combat theory, and in 1938 he presented himself at a military aerodrome without official enrollment in a flying program, and passed the pilot qualification examination through sheer demonstrated competence until the evaluating officer had no legitimate grounds to fail him. That was how Pokreshkin operated. He did not wait for a system to open a door. He studied the problem until he understood it precisely, then solved it, then wrote down what he had learned so he could solve it faster the next time. By June 22, 1941, When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa across a 1,800-kilometer front, he was a senior lieutenant flying MiG-3s with the 55th Fighter Aviation Regiment on the southwestern axis. He had 5 aerial kills by year's end. He had also been shot down twice, made 3 forced landings under fire, and had been brought before a disciplinary board once for destroying a Soviet bomber he had correctly identified as a German-captured aircraft, but that appeared in his regiment's records as friendly. The board was dropped when the wreckage confirmed his identification. The incident made him famous within the regiment and distrusted by certain superiors, a combination that would follow him for the remainder of the war. He encountered the P-39 for the first time in the spring of 1942, when the 55th Regiment was re-equipped with airacobras under the Southern Sector's Lend-Lease allocation. His initial response, recorded in a letter to his wife Maria, was characteristic in its restraint. "The aircraft is unusual. I am studying it." What he studied systematically was what the aircraft could actually do under the conditions he was actually fighting in. The Eastern Front in 1942 was not the Battle of Britain. Soviet and German aircraft alike spent the overwhelming majority of their operational hours below 15,000 feet, and often far below that. The ground war was the engine of the entire conflict: tanks, artillery, motorized infantry, all requiring continuous air support and air cover at low and medium altitude. High-altitude strategic bombing, which consumed British and American planning and procurement thinking, was largely absent from the Eastern Front's tactical reality. Aerial combat happened typically between 3,000 and 12,000 feet. At those altitudes, the P-39 was a different machine than the one-wing Commander Hope had evaluated over Duxford. The Allison V1710 engine, without the turbo supercharger, produced its peak power output below 15,000 feet. At 10,000 feet, the P-39D reached 368 miles per hour, faster than the Bf-109F at that altitude under comparable conditions. The 37 mm4 cannon, slow against a maneuvering fighter at altitude, was lethal at the engagement ranges characteristic of low-level combat, 150 to 300 meters. At those distances, a single round from the M4 could remove a wing panel or destroy a cooling system. The 220 mm cannons in the wing roots added volume to an already overwhelming short-range package. The cockpit visibility, Voronov's exceptional entry from the acceptance inspection, gave pilots situational awareness that was difficult to quantify and impossible to ignore. A pilot who sees everything controls the engagement. A pilot who does not is reacting until he is not reacting at all. The radio equipment, American AN ARC-5 series, was substantially superior to Soviet domestic sets of the period. Pokryshkin's regiment could coordinate in the air in ways that German pilots, long accustomed to fighting Soviet formations that did not coordinate, did not immediately recognize as the change it represented. The aircraft had real dangers. The mid-engine configuration created a weight distribution that punished any pilot who let the machine enter a spin. Recovering from an uncontrolled flat spin in a P-39 required precise technique and sufficient altitude to execute it. Soviet pilots killed in training accidents during the early months of P-39 operations died at a rate that alarmed regiment commanders and prompted written inquiries from the 8th Air Army's Aviation Safety Directorate. The cockpit doors, latching from the outside through a mechanism that could jam under aerodynamic pressure in a dive, occasionally refused to open when a stricken aircraft needed abandoning. A pilot trapped in a burning P-39 was a pilot who did not survive. A ground crew chief named Senior Sergeant Nikolai Fedorov, serving with a regiment operating from an airfield outside Krasnodar in early 1943, fabricated a solution. An emergency release cable routed inside the cockpit to the pilot's left hand, fashioned from steel braid and a machined bracket. That could force the door regardless of external pressure. The modification was not in any American technical publication. It spread to neighboring units by word of mouth, was adopted informally across Soviet P-39 operations, and became standard practice before anyone thought to document it officially. The aircraft demanded respect. It rewarded study. Pokryshkin gave it both. The notebook, now held in the Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense at Podolsk, outside Moscow, is 187 pages long. It is not a diary. It contains no personal reflection, no emotional register. It is a technical document. Each page records a specific air engagement: altitude, airspeed at contact, initial geometry, maneuvers executed by both aircraft, outcome, and Pokryshkin's analytical assessment of what had worked and what had not, written the same evening the engagement occurred, while memory was still precise. He was not recording victories. He was identifying patterns. By the autumn of 1942, he had isolated 3 consistent facts about how the P-39 was producing kills, and 3 consistent facts about how P-39 pilots were dying. He wrote them in the notebook as 2 parallel columns. Then he drew a line connecting them, and he sat with that line for 3 days. The connection was this: the P-39 was most lethal in a fast, high-angle diving attack initiated from outside the enemy's visual detection range, delivered at high closure speed, broken off before the enemy could complete a turning counter. It was most vulnerable in a sustained turning engagement at reduced speed, where the aircraft's mid-engine weight distribution worked against it, and where any upward extension of the fight into the Bf-109's altitude advantage could be exploited. He formulated the principle in 4 Russian words that every pilot in the regiment would memorize within a season: Vysota, Skorost, Maneuver, Ogon, height, speed, maneuver, fire, not 4 equal factors, a hierarchy. Height first, because height was potential energy, and energy was everything available to a pilot before the fight began. Speed second, because a fast aircraft imposed the geometry of the engagement, and a slow one reacted to someone else's geometry. Maneuver third, not turning for its own sake but positioning, achieving the precise angle and range at which one pass was sufficient. Fire last, because if the first 3 were correct, the 4th was a formality. A like on this video takes 2 seconds. For the men who worked out these principles in the air, in combat, at a cost that nobody counted officially, it is the least we can do. The first time Pokryshkin presented this framework formally was not in a classroom. It was at a regimental briefing in October 1942, held in a requisitioned farmhouse outside my cop, with 30 pilots crowded around a single kerosene lamp and a hand-drawn diagram pinned to the plastered wall. He spoke for 40 minutes. Several pilots argued with him, specifically over whether the priority of height over maneuver was universal or conditional. One of the pilots who argued was Lieutenant Grigory Richkalov, 22 years old, from the village of Kudyakovo in the Sverdlovsk Oblast, in the Urals, who would eventually become one of the 5 highest-scoring Allied aces in the entire war. Richkalov said afterward that he had not understood what Pokryshkin meant by height as a primary priority, as a resource to be preserved and expended, rather than a position to be sought in the heat of an engagement, until that night in the farmhouse. He returned to his quarters, rewrote his mental approach to every engagement he had flown since arriving in the P-39, and told Pokryshkin the following morning that the framework was correct. The doctrine had its first deliberate student. The individual had found its first institution. By the spring of 1943, Pokryshkin had been transferred to the 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, the unit that would carry his methods forward for the rest of the war. The Guards designation was not ceremonial. It was awarded by order of the Supreme Headquarters to units that had demonstrated exceptional combat performance, and it carried with it priority allocation of equipment, aviation fuel, and trained replacement pilots. The 16th Guards flew P-39s exclusively. By the summer of 1943, they were flying them according to a doctrine that was spreading faster than any Soviet aviation authority had formally intended. The transmission channels were informal first, then formal in rapid succession. Richkalov taught Pokryshkin's framework to new pilots arriving at the regiment, men who had never met the primary architect of the system, who had never seen the notebook, who received the doctrine the way a soldier receives a march, by doing it under supervision until it became automatic. The Soviet military aviation journal Vestnik Vozdechnogo Floater published 2 articles in 1943 describing advanced fighter combat methods for the current theater of operations, drawn directly from the 16th Guards' documented performance, without naming the source. The 8th Air Army's Pilot Training Directorate incorporated the altitude-speed maneuver fire hierarchy into its formal training syllabus at Stalingrad in the autumn of 1943. The individual had become institutional. The insight was now larger than any one man. Richkalov demonstrates this better than any statistic. He was 22 in 1942, recovering from a wound that grounded him for 3 months. When he returned to flight status, he joined a regiment that had already internalized the Pokryshkin method, not from Pokryshkin directly, but from pilots who had attended the farmhouse briefing or pilots who had been briefed by those pilots, or through the aviation journal articles. He had never read the notebook. By 1944, Richkalov held 56 confirmed kills. He flew the same aircraft by the same doctrine, sharpened through the same systematic analysis of what actually produced kills, and the system had transmitted that doctrine to him without requiring him to reinvent it. That is what doctrine does. It transfers insight without requiring the receiver to bleed for it a second time. Across the front line, a different process was underway. In January 1942, Luftwaffe fighter units on the Eastern Front were operating at roughly 80% of authorized strength, with pilots averaging more than 300 flight hours each. By the summer of 1943, that average had fallen below 200 hours, not because the training curriculum had been shortened on paper, but because the men who had accumulated 300 hours were being killed faster than the training pipeline could fill the gap behind them. And the training schools themselves were being stripped of experienced instructor pilots to cover combat losses in operational units. By late 1943, Luftwaffe fighter replacement pilots were arriving at Eastern Front airfields with between 150 and 200 total flight hours, men whose predecessors had considered 300 hours the absolute minimum for frontline service. This was not a failure of national will or individual courage. It was a system coming apart under the arithmetic of attrition. The experienced pilots who survived accumulated scores that made them legendary: Erich Hartmann with 352 kills, Gerhard Barkhorn with 301, Günther Röhl with 275, and those men were genuinely extraordinary. But they were a thin, capable layer over training pipeline that was producing men who were not ready for the environment they were entering, and the environment was getting harder. A Luftwaffe operational report from the III Group of the 52nd Fighter Wing, filed after engagements over the Cuban bridgehead in April 1943, noted with careful professional understatement that Soviet fighter behavior had changed materially since the previous operational period. The report described enemy aircraft engaging with initiative, dictating altitude before the initial contact, delivering attacks at high closure speed, and disengaging before a turning counter could develop. One pilot, recorded only as Oberfeldwebel K. in the debriefing transcript, stated that the Soviet fighters he had encountered appeared to have studied something. Their attack sequence was not improvised. He was right, it was not improvised. It had been written in a farmhouse outside Maikop 6 months earlier. Now stop. Put aside the aircraft specifications, put aside the performance data, consider what the record actually shows. The critics of the P-39 airacobra hope the American operational planners, the Luftwaffe Intelligence Directorate, were not wrong. Read their assessments again and the errors are not there. The performance figures are accurate, the handling complaints are valid. The rejection of the aircraft for first-line service in Northwest Europe was the correct decision for Northwest Europe. They were asking the right question about the wrong war. The question they asked was, can this aircraft compete with a Bf-109 above 15,000 feet over France? The answer was no. The answer is still no. The question they should have asked was, can this aircraft compete with a Bf-109 below 12,000 feet over Ukraine, flown by a pilot who has spent months learning precisely how to use it offensively against that exact opponent? The answer to that question was available in 1941. Nobody asked it because nobody had reason to imagine the combination. If this story has stayed with you, if you want to understand the decisions that actually shaped how wars are won, this channel needs your subscription to keep telling stories like this one. The answer to why the P-39 dominated in Soviet hands is not one thing. It is three things that happened simultaneously. The first is the theater. The Eastern Front's combat altitudes were not the altitudes the P-39 had been rejected for. Below 12,000 feet, the Allison engine was competitive with every German type the Soviets faced. This was not marginal. The Bf-109's performance edge at high altitude simply did not exist at 10,000 feet. The P-39 was not fighting the same war the British had fought. It was fighting a structurally different war in which one of its principal limitations was operationally irrelevant. The second is the cannon. The 37 Mem-4 firing through the propeller shaft was a weapon German pilots on the Eastern Front encountered with a shock they had not been prepared for. The RAF had found it a liability in turning engagements at altitude, and they were right. Soviet pilots, applying the doctrine of high-speed diving attack at short range, used it precisely as it had been designed, a single-pass weapon delivering lethal force at close range, requiring no sustained opportunity for the enemy to maneuver. At 150 meters, the 37 did not damage a Bf-109. It ended the engagement with a definitiveness that other aircraft types, relying on rifle-caliber weapons, could not reliably achieve. The third reason reframes everything else. The Luftwaffe was running a deficit. The experienced pilots who could have recognized the Pokryshkin doctrine by its geometry, who had the accumulated hours to read a diving attack before it arrived, were being killed faster than they could be replaced. The P-39 doctrine was improving and spreading at precisely the moment the Luftwaffe's capacity to counter it was declining. These two curves intersected somewhere in early 1943. After that intersection, the technical comparison between the aircraft mattered less than the institutional comparison between the organizations. One was learning. One was bleeding. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States delivered 4,952 P-39 airacobras to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease, the largest allocation of any single aircraft type to any single Allied nation. Soviet pilots flying P-39s were credited by their own aviation directorates with the destruction of more than 5,000 German aircraft in confirmed engagements. The documented ratio of kills to P-39 losses in air combat exceeded 4-1 across the theater. In the 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment alone, pilots accumulated individual scores that, had they been recorded under American or British insignia, would have generated the kind of press coverage that built public narratives about the war. They were not household names in the West. In the Soviet Union, they were something different, not celebrities, because the Soviet state did not produce celebrities in the Western sense but exemplars, models, the kind of men a state points to when it needs proof that the system produces what it claims. Pokryshkin's individual confirmed total reached 59 kills before he flew his last mission over Prague on May 19, 1945. 48 of those kills were made in P-39s, the majority of them in the specific combination of high-closure diving attack and short-range cannon fire that his notebook had codified. His scoring rate, kills per combat sortie, over 200 missions, exceeded that of every other Soviet pilot who flew comparable operational exposure. He was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union 3 times, the third presentation made by Stalin personally in August 1944, an event whose political choreography Stalin's staff planned carefully because decorating the same man 3 times with the highest honor was without precedent. When Pokryshkin's name appeared in Luftwaffe operational communications by late 1943 as a threat designation to be broadcast on combat radio frequencies, Achtung, Pokryshkin, as a warning to break contact, the gesture represented something the German military otherwise reserved for weather and terrain. Grigory Rechkalov finished the war with 58 confirmed kills, 56 of them in P-39s. Nikolai Gyulev, 30 years old, from Aksay on the Don River, flying with the 129th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, reached 57 confirmed kills with a scoring rate per mission that Pokryshkin described in writing as unprecedented in my observation. Gyulev was known for an aggressive closing technique, shorter range than doctrine specified, demanding extraordinary aircraft handling precision, and for a personal tactical refinement that extended the doctrine's effectiveness, a high-deflection shot against an enemy attempting to turn away from a diving attack. Delivered at the precise angle where the 37 cannon's trajectory intersected the fleeing aircraft's path, the shot required practice and judgment that no manual could teach. It spread through the regiment by demonstration, pilot to pilot, at every airfield briefing where Gyulev was present to explain it. On July 7, 1943, the third day of the Battle of Kursk, the largest armored engagement in the history of land warfare, Pokryshkin's regiment flew continuous air cover over Soviet ground forces in the Prokhorovka sector. The regiment flew 41 sorties. Against them flew elements of the III group of the 52nd Fighter Wing, veterans with collective scores representing years of Eastern Front service, flying Bf-109 GS in a theater they had occupied since 1941. By the end of the operational day, the 16th Guards had claimed 9 confirmed aerial victories, with 2 P-39s damaged and no pilots killed. The III group's debriefing records, recovered in 1945, describe losses attributed to unfamiliar attack geometries suggesting new tactical training. The Luftwaffe analyst who wrote those words had arrived closer to the truth than his directorate had managed in 18 months of P-39 assessments. The field modifications compounded the story in ways that never found their way into official records. Soviet mechanics, working at forward airfields sometimes within range of German artillery, developed adaptations the aircraft's American designers had not specified. Fedorov's emergency door release became standard. A weight reduction achieved by removing the rear fuselage secondary radio set, deemed redundant given the cockpit equipment's superiority, gave a measurable improvement in low-altitude climb rate. The M4 cannon sight calibration was adjusted by armament shops of the 8th Air Army, from the American standard 300-meter convergence setting to a Soviet-specified 150 meters, reflecting the doctrine's requirement that the pilot close before firing. These were not engineering decisions recorded in technical directives. They were combat decisions made by men with grease on their hands who had figured out what the aircraft was actually for and who changed it accordingly. The most documented single engagement in the P-39's Soviet operational record occurred on May 14, 1944, near Iasi in eastern Romania, where Soviet forces were advancing against German and Romanian defensive lines. Pokryshkin led a flight of 8 P-39s against a German package, identified as 24 Bf-109GS and FW-190 as an escort and ground attack formation moving towards Soviet armor concentrations. The attack was initiated from altitude, from outside confirmed German visual detection range, using the standard doctrine. In 11 minutes of continuous engagement, the 8 P-39s claimed 7 confirmed kills and dispersed the formation without losing a single aircraft. Both the 16th Guards mission report and the German 52nd Wing's operational log document the engagement. The German record describes coordinated multiple diving attacks executed with apparent preplanned sequencing, suggesting practiced formation-level application of a standardized attack doctrine. The preplanned sequence was Pokryshkin's notebook. It had traveled from a farmhouse briefing to a regiment, to a training directorate, to a syllabus to 8 pilots who had never individually invented it, and did not need to. Oberstleutnant Johann Steinhoff, a 49 confirmed kills veteran of the Eastern and Mediterranean fronts, who survived the war and later became a general in the post-war West German Luftwaffe, addressed the P-39 question directly in his 1965 memoir, The Straits of Messina, in a passage that has become the closest thing available to an official enemy accounting of what they had faced. We had made the mistake, early in the Eastern Campaign, of reading the assessments of our opponent's allies as though those assessments constituted final verdicts. The Bell aircraft had been returned by the British. We read that and we drew the obvious conclusion, which was correct as far as it went. We did not ask, and I believe this was the error, whether the Soviet pilots were operating under different conditions, against different priorities, with a different system of instruction. By 1943, we understood that the aircraft we were encountering was not the aircraft described in the British assessment. The Soviet pilots had found something in it that the British had not looked for. What they found was a method. The method was the thing we had not studied and could not quickly develop an answer to. He was right. He was right in 1965 in precisely the way the pre-war Luftwaffe Intelligence Directorate had been wrong in 1942, clear-eyed about the hardware, blind to the doctrine. The P-39's transition out of Soviet frontline service began in 1944, not because the aircraft had failed, but because Soviet domestic production, specifically the Yak-3 and La-7, had caught up with and exceeded it across most of the performance envelope that mattered. The transition was resisted by pilots who understood what they had mastered. Richkalov flew P-39s on personal authorization into the spring of 1945. Pokryshkin transitioned to the La-7 and described the airacobra in his 1968 memoir as a machine that demanded honesty. It showed you immediately whether you understood it or not, and it rewarded you without reservation for understanding. The officer who ordered the 16th Guards' final conversion away from P-39s was Colonel Pavel Pokryshev, no relation, who, according to the regiment's post-war history, resisted the order from the 8th Air Army's Materiel Directorate until told explicitly that the decision was final. He had watched what the aircraft could do in specific hands flying a specific doctrine. He was not wrong to resist. He simply had no argument the Directorate was required to hear. The Soviet Union's post-war aviation establishment was built substantially by the generation that had fought and survived inside it. Pokryshkin moved through the peacetime ranks as the Air Force institutionalized the lessons of the war it had won. He reached Marshal of Aviation, the highest rank the Soviet Air Service held in 1972, having served as Deputy Commander of Soviet Air Defense Forces through the Cold War's most precarious decades. He retired in 1981. He wrote 2 memoirs. He gave hundreds of speeches. He died in Moscow on November 13, 1985, 72 years old, in an apartment on Gorky Street, in the city that had been renamed from the one he was born in. The apartment is now a small museum. The plaque outside it reads, in Russian, Here lived the three-time hero of the Soviet Union. The neighbors know who he was. The foreign tourists who pass it mostly do not. Grigory Richkalov retired from the Soviet Air Forces as a general in 1959, returned to the Urals region near where he had been born, and spent his final decades in Yekaterinburg. He died in 1990, aged 70, the Soviet Union still intact, his war still officially commemorated on May 9 each year. His medals are in a regional history museum. His flight records are in the archive at Podolsk. Nikolai Gyulev, who finished the war with 57 kills and was removed from combat duty by direct order of his regiment's commander in 1944, on the stated grounds that losing him would cost the regiment more than any tactical advantage justified, retired from the Air Forces in 1979 and is buried in Moscow. The regiment he flew with held reunions every year until the last surviving member died in 2013. They met quietly. They did not receive significant press coverage. Now read the enemy's final accounting. Steinhoff's passage from the Straits of Messina is the most precise enemy explanation on record. But there is a second document. A brief post-war interview conducted by the American aviation historian von Hardesty with a former Luftwaffe pilot, not Steinhoff, a different man, a Feldwebel who had flown Bf 109 GS on the Southern Eastern Front in 1943 and requested that his name not appear in publication, contains this exchange. Hardesty, when did you first understand that the airacobra was a serious threat? The pilot, when I stopped seeing the aircraft and started seeing the system. Until that point we were looking for a mistake in the aircraft itself, a technical weakness we could exploit. But there was no single weakness that was large enough. The weakness was that we had decided early what the aircraft was and had not changed our decision. The Soviet pilots had not made that decision, they had kept studying. He was not forgiving the aircraft the limitations it genuinely had. He was acknowledging that limits are only defeats when your enemy operates within them. The Soviets had found the operating space outside the limits and had built a doctrine to live there. The context is the entire lesson. An aircraft is not good or bad in isolation. It is suited or unsuited to a specific combination of altitude, mission, enemy capability, and the doctrine the operating force has built around its actual strengths. The P-39 was rejected by the British for specific, accurate, documented reasons. The Soviets did not disprove those reasons. They made those reasons irrelevant by fighting a war in which the limitations did not apply to the conditions they faced. Doctrine spreads faster than aircraft can be manufactured. Pokrishkin's notebook reached 30 pilots at a farmhouse briefing in October 1942. The 8th Air Army incorporated it into a training syllabus that reached hundreds of pilots annually by 1943. The notebook cost nothing to reproduce. Each P-39 cost approximately $50,000 in 1943 dollars to manufacture, ship, and assemble. The doctrine moved faster than the aircraft. And the archive is silent about what mattered most. Fedorov's emergency door release cable, fabricated from steel braid in a machine bracket, at an airfield outside Krasnodar in early 1943, kept an unknown number of pilots alive who would otherwise have died in aircraft they could not exit. The number is unknown because the modification was not written down until it was already standard practice, and the men it saved did not know their survival required noting. The most consequential decisions in this story were made by people whose names are not famous, whose notebooks were not archived, whose modifications were not recorded because they seemed too obvious to document at the time they occurred. If your father, grandfather, or great-uncle flew any aircraft in this war in any air force on any side, I want to hear about it in the comments. What unit? What aircraft? What did they say about it late in their lives when they said anything at all? Those accounts exist in family memory and nowhere else. Share them here. Today, a Bell P-39 airacobra hangs in the permanent collection of the Central Museum of the Great Patriotic War, Victory Park, on Kutuzovsky Prospect in Moscow. It is painted in Soviet Air Forces markings, with red stars on the wings and a 3-digit tactical number on the fuselage. The museum label identifies it as a Lend-Lease aircraft supplied by the United States of America under the terms of the 1941 Mutual Aid Agreement. The label does not explain what was found inside it, what was discovered about the aircraft by men who were not its designers, who were not its intended operators, who received it because there was nothing better available and made it into something its critics had concluded it could not be. Nikolai Fedorov, Senior Sergeant, Ground Crew Chief, 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, 1943. He is not in any history book that I have found. What he made, a cable, a bracket, a modification to a door that locked when pilots needed it open, spread through Soviet P-39 units before anyone thought to write his name alongside it. The pilots his modification kept alive flew the doctrine that won the engagements that shifted the campaign. His name is not on any monument. There is no plaque in any town. He was a mechanic who looked at a problem and solved it and moved on to the next problem. It was enough, it was more than enough. It was, in the end, exactly what the war required.